Hi, and welcome to the Good Girl Confessional Podcast. Welcome back. I'm your host, Sandy Lowries, and the Good Girl Confessional Podcast is proudly brought to us by WB40, Women Beyond 40, a platform for women 40, 50, 60, and beyond who want to talk about the nitty-gritty of life in midlife. You can join us at WB40.com. Before we begin today's podcast, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this podcast is recorded, and in my case, that's the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nations, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and pay homage to their ancient history of storytelling. Today in the podcast, I am very excited to be talking to Sarah Steele. Sarah, for those that don't know, is an incredible podcast host. Her podcast is Let's Talk About Sex, where she talks about sex, cults, and coercive control. And Sarah is a producer, writer, podcast presenter and filmmaker, and she is the author of her incredible book, Do As I Say. It is a fantastic book. If you're interested at all of the links are going to be in our show notes, and I highly recommend that you go out and read this book. It's really great. If you love a good podcast, you will really love this. It is a very serious podcast that really does look at the societal issues of coercive control and cults, how they start, and how people are involved in them, and more importantly, how people are supported when they're able to leave. Please welcome to the confessional the very lovely Sarah Steele.
Hey there! When Sandy's not interviewing kick-ass women, she's hanging out with me at Alex the Seal, a podcast about music and nostalgia. I'm Jo Pybus, and each episode, Sandy and I talk about all the songs that got us hooked up, knocked up, and broken up. Do yourself a favour and search Alex the Seal on your podcast app. Love you, Molly.
Hi, Sarah, and welcome to the confessional. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, and thanks for having me.
Oh, I am very excited to have you because I'm a huge fan of your brilliant podcast, Let's Talk About Sex, and I can never say that right because of my little list here. I knew this would be a fun one, but it's SECTS, that kind of sex we're talking about today. And I know that you have a huge following for your podcast, and rightly so, because it is quite an incredible feat how many people you have spoken to who have been involved in cults, sects, and you know, or had near brushes with these sort of environments. So I wanted to jump in, I guess, to say, tell us a little bit about you for those that haven't listened yet to the podcast, because you are quite extraordinary. You are quite a number of things, not just a podcast host.
That's very kind. Thank you, Sandy. Well, yeah, I mean, the podcast, honestly, the whole thing kind of took me by surprise. I came into it with no real idea what I was getting myself into. And I think it was just this kind of interesting timing issue of like the rise in podcast listening, and hitting upon a subject that actually there's a lot of coverage of the more sensational aspects of cults. And the cults that you've heard of are probably the Branch Davidians and Jonestown and all of these kinds of ones. In Australia, it's probably the Family. But I started talking to people in the beginning. I was looking at those kinds of groups, but then I was approached by more and more people who wanted to tell me about a group that I had never heard of, and a group that, you know, didn't live on a compound, and a group that someone who you work with might be involved with. And I hadn't realized when I started how many people were actually involved in these groups. Now it's no surprise to me whatsoever that if I'll start chatting about the podcast at a party or something, no surprise if someone I'm speaking to says, actually, my friend is in a cult, or I grew up in a cult, or I know someone who I think I'm a bit worried about, a friend of mine. So it was a huge shock to me to find out how ubiquitous these groups are, how many of them there are out there, and how under the radar they're flying. But it's sort of taken over my life since I started Let's Talk About Sects, which was originally back in, I think, 2017. And as you said, I've also now done a few other bits and pieces related to that, including putting out a book last year.
Yes, you did. And we will get to the book because I'm super excited to talk about your wonderful book, Do As I Say, which is a great read as well. So we'll get to that. What initially, I guess, drew you to the subject matter? Because at the time when you launched this podcast, there really was no one specifically looking at sex. And as you said, other than the sensationalism of it, what drew you, I guess, even to this kind of field?
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to think about now that there were no other podcasts about cults at the time when I started conceiving of it. By the time I went to launch, there was one other, Joe Thornley's Zealot, which is another Australian podcast about cults. But I mean, even then, that there were no other podcasts at the time about the subject is just, it makes no sense now. There are so many, which is fantastic. But I just had that same fascination that so many people have, you know, this kind of so many questions about like how is it that people become enmeshed in these organizations that cause them to behave in ways that they actually otherwise would never have behaved in, and, you know, sometimes do things that are actually completely against their usual morals and ethics. And, you know, I had questions about kind of brainwashing and whether it really even is a thing. And there's a lot of academic debates about stuff like that I kind of got to dig into in the research. So it was just that same fascination in the beginning that got me interested. But the more I started talking to people who had direct experiences and the more they shared with me those direct experiences, the more apparent it became to me that this is, honestly, I feel like this is a real social justice issue. Like, this is a big problem. There are people coming out of these organizations every day who are dealing with high levels of trauma. And a lot of countries around the world are not doing an awful lot to stop these organizations from kind of controlling people's lives and their choices.
Yeah, and it's quite... It's quite insidious, really, when you think about it. And there's a lot of debate in Australia right now about coercive control and that, you know, how do we put measures in place to protect women and anybody really. But this comes into the domestic violence argument about coercive control and what is it. So when people talk about brainwashing, I guess my mind goes to that. It lends itself to coercive control and how easy it could be for any of us to be coerced depending on what's going on in your life, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that it's a sort of a self-protection mechanism, as it is when we think about domestic abuse relationships, to think, well, I would never end up in that situation, or to ask the question, why didn't you just leave? Which people who've come out of domestically abusive relationships get asked all the time, and people who've come out of cults get asked all the time. And so it helps you psychologically to think that would never happen to me. But I don't think that that's the case anymore at all. And all the people I've spoken to, you know, the huge majority of them they're such well-meaning and wonderful people, many intelligent, you know, thoughtful people who the main thing that they probably have in common is that they were quite idealistic and they had a lot of passion that they wanted to dedicate to doing something meaningful with their lives. And so all that's happened with these people is that they've come across the wrong group at the wrong time. And I always talk about how this is usually a vulnerable point in your life. People think that vulnerable people join cults, but actually what happens is people who are at vulnerable points in their lives fall into cults by accident. And a cult, you know, it doesn't look like a cult from the outside. You don't find that out until probably after you've left, long after you've left. But those sorts of vulnerable times, they happen, you know, when you're moving out of home, and that's why university students can be big recruiting grounds for many cults. You're looking at your life and trying to figure out like what you want to do with it, what you want to dedicate yourself to. You might have come out of a long-term relationship, or you might have lost someone who is really dear to you, and it's caused you to kind of question everything and want to, you know, do something really important. And all of us have those points in our lives, every single one of us. And so actually the idealism that people put into these groups, that's to me often the greatest tragedy of them, is that you've got so many wonderful and well-meaning people who have so much to give, and they're giving it to an organization that's usually about lining the pockets of the guy at the top, to grossly generalize. You know, there are many exceptions, but that tends to be what's actually happening. And I always have to say that you really need to keep in mind it's not always people joining these groups either. There are many, many, many people, and many who I've spoken to, who are born in and they never made that choice.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating for me, because, you know, we do have to have that distinction, I guess, for those that find themselves joining an organisation. Nobody wakes up, and I've heard you say this, and I've heard people like, you know, Mike Rinder say this sort of thing. No one wakes up and to join a cult, right? No one decides to join a cult. And what happens is, I guess, that we attach ourselves to things that seem like they're for the greater good, or things that are going to enhance us spiritually or you know, physically, or whatever it may be. And I think that is really important. And the point that you've made, that, you know, many, many, many intelligent people find themselves in these situations. I know that last year you were at Vivid in Sydney and you were on a panel discussion, and one of the people that was on that panel was the wonderful Claire Ashman. Claire's been a guest on this podcast as well, and I think her story was so extraordinary that we had a two-part thing going on here with her. So Claire's a really great example of that, you know, of being born into what she didn't even know was really a sect, or, you know, and then basically marrying someone who leads her into yet another because she really doesn't know any different. I guess you would have spoken to lots of people who have experienced similar things.
Yeah, and Claire, I mean, she's such an incredible woman. You know, her experience is just, I can't believe the things that she's so strong. You know, she came out of that with all of her children and managed to build a whole new life. She's just so amazing. But yeah, what choices did she ever have? And she was brought up to believe that, you know, women are supposed to be subservient to men. She was, you know, married to a much, much older man, and she never really was able to express her opinion. So she ended up in the Order of St. Charbel, and, you know, who can possibly blame her for it?
No one. And I think it was really, so when I first started this podcast, Claire actually reached out to me and said, I've got a story and I think you might be interested. And I just thought, I was so taken by her bravery and her extraordinary strength to tell that story. You know, for those that haven't listened to Claire, she's quite extraordinary. She does have a TEDx talk. People can listen to her story, and we can put up links to her episode on this podcast and yours. She's quite extraordinary, but I think, as you say, to then, and her story's brilliant in terms of, she's a great example of what happens when somebody's been involved in a cult for a very long time, because a lot of people may not understand this. When she left, yes, with all of her children, but she had no money, no bank account, no passport, no driver's license, nothing. She basically went out into the world with literally the clothes on her back and the clothes that her children were wearing. And this is why, you know, when people say, why don't you just leave?
That's exactly right. It took a sheriff knocking on her door and saying that she was going to be turfed out. And her response was, great, tell me what to do. I've been wanting to get out for ages. And so he gave her some advice on what she needed to do next, which is just, so incredible. But that's right. I mean, she didn't even know how to open a bank account. And it's really worth trying to put yourself in that headspace of being like, how could that possibly feel, trying to go out into a world? And I mean, she's quite an extreme example, but I would say, you know, most people, what they're looking at is they've been taught that everything outside of the group is evil. It's a real us and them mentality. So even if there aren't those real, like, physical, you know, commune-based type limitations on leaving, what you're still doing is really entering into the unknown, and most of the time leaving behind your entire network and your entire community, the people who you consider to be your family and friends, whether they literally are or not. And, you know, most of the time taught that what you're probably going to end up in is some kind of hell, like possible death, probable damnation. It's such a huge decision to make. And I regularly, when I'm speaking to people, ask myself that question: would I, if I were in their position, would I have been strong enough to make that decision? And I think that's the thing that you really need to keep in mind is just have a lot more empathy for that situation that those people find themselves in. And even then, when you talk about leaving, it's kind of like a lot of people think once you leave, great, woohoo, you're out of there, you're free. Actually, then the hard work really begins. You're building an entire life for yourself. You're trying to create a new network and a community among people who you don't share a lot of commonalities. You might not have even kind of watched any of the or read any of the media or watched any of the TV shows that are their common kind of reference points. Like, there's just so much to deal with when you come out of a cult, and finding appropriate psychological help as well as financial assistance to kind of get you back on your feet. Very hard to do.
Yeah, really hard to do. And that's one of the things, again, as I say about Claire, who's really brilliant, is the work that she has done in helping to support other people who find themselves in that circumstance and who are leaving. But I think you touched on a really great point there as well, that not every example is as extreme as that one. And in fact, recently I know that you've that you've spoken to people like Sarah and Nippy from, they've got their own podcast, A Little Bit Culty, which is fab. But they are two people, husband and wife, who escaped, Nexium, which is a cult. People can watch The Vow, which is currently on Netflix, if they haven't already. But theirs is a really interesting story, I think, because we're talking about highly intelligent, educated people, really smart, had access to, really, if they wanted to be looking at the internet or to be looking at all of these things, and yet they're involved in a community of people who basically say you can't listen to what they're saying out there because they're not evolved. No one out there is evolved. No one really understands what it is that we're doing, and we're like a higher, on this higher plane, and we're going to be basically working to make humanity so much better. Everything was about humanity. Yeah, how was it, like, I guess, having the opportunity to chat with them, I guess, so close to them leaving, so it's a fairly new still for them.
Yeah, and I mean, they've been through a lot, those people, anyone who's been involved with that organisation. And I'd done an episode about Nexium, and I had actually chosen not to try to reach out to anyone to speak to them about their experiences because they sounded so extreme, and I tend to make sure people are really ready to talk. And there was a lot out there, so it was easy to research that one and to find their stories without having to kind of re-traumatize anybody. But then, yes, to speak to them afterwards was it was a real pleasure. But yeah, I mean, they just joined kind of a self-help course, kind of. That was the setup of Nexium, and at the outset it seemed like it was doing really good things for them personally. And I think that the case with Nexium and so many other similar groups is, by the time the bad press starts coming out, most of the people who've joined much earlier, they've become so involved and they've given so much of their lives and dedicated themselves to whatever the teaching is. There's a real sunk cost fallacy as well that goes on to give up all of that, what you have to admit to yourself. I mean, it's pretty big. I remember I spoke to Sarah and Nippy about that there are some, former Nexium followers, members, whatever you would call them, adherents, devotees, who are still pretty devoted to Keith Raniere and still they can't step outside of that viewpoint. And they're probably going to stick to those views, who knows, possibly forever. But their perspective was that, yeah, the amount that you have to kind of give up to come to terms with the truth of the situation, it's a lot. It's hard to imagine. I often think shame is an emotion. It's a really damaging emotion. It's like one of the worst emotions that you can have. And so humans' ability to try and avoid the feeling of shame, it can be a thing that drives us to do some pretty wild stuff. And actually, shame also is a big part of why there's not enough knowledge about how these groups operate out there, because once people leave and come to terms with what's happened, the shame that they might feel is actually placed on them by society, because society still judges them for having been involved with one of these groups. always asks, why didn't you leave? Why did you join? All of these questions that put it on the individual rather than like, why did that person coerce and manipulate you, and how are they still being allowed to get away with it? And so I think that there's a huge amount of work to do in destigmatizing former members of cults so that we can have these conversations openly and learn from their experiences, which is a huge thing that I've been trying to do with the podcast.
Oh, absolutely. And I do think that education is such a massive, massive tool for society, really, to start to understand what it is that these people have gone through, have survived. And we need to think about that. These are victims. These are not people, as we said before, no one wakes up one day and says, guess what, I'm going to go and find a cult and join one. Of course, nobody does that. But these are victims and of a number of horrendous things that have gone on, some obviously surviving worse than others, but at the end of the day, they've all been traumatized. And I think that's another really important message too. There's really not enough support out there from what I'm hearing or for what I tried to research about, who is supporting those people as they come out, who financially supports them or emotionally supports them or helps to get them out of a state or a country or whatever it may be, because some people are facing that very real thing as well. There's not really a lot of support out there. And I guess the more education through people like yourself and the more people start to understand this, do you think that will change?
I really hope so. And, I'm really interested in getting involved in more advocacy work on a number of different fronts, because I just see, I do think education is so important. And I think hearing all of these stories and hearing the similarities between them, in spite of the differences in the belief systems of all of these organizations, some of which are religious and some of which are not even religious at all, they're completely different groups. And I think that helps to draw those lines between the commonalities and the ways that coercive control operates in a group setting. But beyond that, we have to start doing something about it. I just keep seeing that just not enough is being done to stop this from happening to more people. And as you say, to help people who've exited. So I do hope that as, awareness gets higher, that also the support systems will, that are needed will come into place. And so, yeah, I'm really hopeful of doing some advocacy work on that. But it's interesting when you look at really specific groups. Some of the best models for helping people out are those which are kind of set up for very specific cultic organizations. So there's a good example, which I refer to a few times in the book, which is called the Gloria Vale Leavers Support Trust in New Zealand. And that's just set up around this one community, Gloria Vale Christian community, and a local Baptist church kind of saw the abuses that were going on in there, and they provided paths out to people, which include so much support, putting people up in their own homes and kind of helping them to access all sorts of different levels of support. And then also giving them access to legal avenues to look for recourse for what they've been through. And that's just all down to a few initially volunteers becoming really passionate about helping those in a specific community. And for many years before that, there weren't many people able to exit Gloria Vale. But once that path became available to them, many, many people have left over the past few years. And, there are employment court cases that are coming out talking about what has actually been going on with those people. And, things are really looking like they're starting to shift there. But it can't just be on this kind of piecemeal voluntary basis when it comes to specific groups. I just think there has to be something more wide scale. And, there are groups that they're not going to have that exact support system. There are many, many cults with a wider membership that have really good former member kind of peer support scenarios going on, which is fantastic when people can talk about their experiences. But with groups like the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, they have shut down some of those former member websites where people were trying to support each other based on kind of ideas around, I think, defamation. So, there's a lot of complicating factors there. But then there are many smaller groups that are never going to have those big peer support networks just based around, one of these, couple of hundred members in a regional New South Wales community. So I just think it has to be a much more open support system than just, passionate volunteers looking at specific groups in a piecemeal fashion.
No, I agree. I do think that, how amazing would it be if there was an umbrella organisation that could support anybody leaving any sort of sect, cult, regardless of how small or how big it is, who could then, definitely, direct them to places that are more specific about what it is that they've been through. And of course, one of the things that we forget about is that some of these cults are huge. And we mean by huge, I mean that they are so financially wealthy that they have a lot of clout behind them. When we just talked about Nexium, for example, with one unlimited sources of funding, a lot of money behind them, which means that they had access to lawyers, PR people, also, like it's a reality. So they were shutting down things. But with that also, and obviously a big one that a lot of people talk about, of course, is Scientology, these sort of organisations that come under the banner of a church and yet there's no actual religion involved. And there's a lot of money and a lot of clout behind them and a lot of really powerful people involved in these groups that keep these things ticking along. I don't know, is there ever going to be a way that those sort of huge, powerful organisations can be taken to task for the things that they put their devotees through? I mean, I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, really, really difficult question. And I mean, Scientology would definitely argue that they are a religion. And when you look at their various belief systems, I mean, I guess it's a wild sort of a religion, but it has been defined as a religion in many countries, Australia included. And I mean, I look at examples, I suppose, with the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Like they're a recognised religion, seen as fairly mainstream. The people I talk to who've come out of the Jehovah's Witnesses definitely think that it's a cult. And the shunning practices that happen when you leave the JWs, I mean, they're hugely, hugely damaging. And so in some countries, I'm going to get this wrong. I think it was in Denmark, but I would have to double check that. But somewhere in Europe, one of the countries has said, actually, this shunning practice, this is not acceptable. And so they were looking to take, I believe, their charity status away if they continued the shunning practice. And I'm not sure what the outcome of that specific movement has been. But you also see in Australia, an example with the JWs is that they were refusing to sign up for the the outcome. It was the institutional responses to abuse in religions and the restitution schemes that came about as a result of that. And they were just refusing to get involved. And so Australia then also threatened to withdraw their charity status. And that's when they signed up to the scheme. And so there are certain abuses where you can hold some of these bigger organizations to account. And so I guess my big question is, right, if we're looking at coercive control as being a crime, when we're looking at one-on-one domestic abuse relationships, if you read the definitions under that crime, when you're looking at the New South Wales context, they apply to cults. They apply to cults. It's the exact same methods of coercive control that we're saying are a crime in a one-on-one relationship, but they're happening in a larger scale when it comes to a cult. So my question would be, when you've got a big organization that is exhibiting all of these same behaviors, these are the things that we should be able to hold them to account on. And so, I do think that there are ways, and I do really have hopes that like some of these groups, some of the less damaging ones, they could actually change. And maybe that's a naive hope, but the more that we recognize this coercive behavior as being unacceptable in our society, then the more chance we have to try and stop some of the damage from happening.
Yeah, absolutely, because that's generally, you talk about shunning, that practice, which of course for me definitely falls under the whole coercive control thing, that shunning practice actually is what keeps a lot of people in a situation where they've now sort of had an awakening, if you like, or they're aware this is not good for me and it is not good for anyone in this community, and I really want to leave. But if I leave, I know that my family, my immediate family, all of my friends and all of my community and all of these people that I've loved and respected are going to turn their back on me and will never talk to me again. That's a frightening concept for most of us.
That's exactly right. And it is absolutely a method of control. Like, that's what keeps you there. I mean, if I had to give up my relationship with my family and friends for anything, I mean, I have no idea if I would do it. I think many people are trapped in these situations for exactly that reason.
Yeah, look, 100% I agree with that. And I know, like, listening to people like Leah Remini and Mike Rinder, who are huge advocates and supporters of those leaving the Church of Scientology as they did themselves. That's something that they talk about consistently. They have both lost so much, to lose family and to lose friends and to lose your children, to lose all contact with your children, which has happened to Mike Rinder. It's horrid. I mean, it's absolutely horrendous what goes on with these people, and the courage of people like them, who were very high profile as well in the Church of Scientology, to step forward and talk about the practices that happen, and also then to talk about the consequences of leaving quite openly, and to talk about their shame, and to talk about, their part in this, and as well, which I guess you can't process that till you've left, but their incredible bravery leads to helping other people get out, right?
Yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, they're just so incredible for the way that they speak out, particularly with Scientology, because it really goes after people who speak out, And I do think also with Scientology and some of the other groups I've looked at, a really common thing that I see is exploitative labour that happens. In Scientology, people sign these billion-year contracts to be part of the Sea Org, and then they're like working for cents or something, like dollars a week, to, I don't know, build communities and do whatever Tom Cruise might need. Like, it's like the exploitative labor that happens in some of these organizations. That's something that we should probably be able to figure out a way to stop in a legal sense as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do think that those sects and cults that have very cleverly, I guess, kind of fallen under the religion umbrella or the church umbrella, it seems that they're afforded like different kinds of scrutiny by government bodies because they're a church, right? And I would say the same is probably true for what we would call mainstream religion, and that would be, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, or whatever. But they seem to be able to operate in ways that are not scrutinised very heavily by governments.
Yeah, and I think, volunteer work is actually fine. Like, doing volunteer work for any organisation, if it's a great organisation, no problem. I got no problem with it. It's a really good thing. I've done some myself. But it's more the extent to which that labour is exploited is going to be a lot more in the cultic groups that I look at. It's the hours and hours and hours that people are putting in. And even if they have regular jobs, it's like all of their spare time might be going to work for the organisation. And so they're considered volunteers. The 12 Tribes is a really good example in Australia. I mean, the labour that people do in that organisation, they hand over all their belongings to join, and then they work for the organisation. And it's supposed to be a pretty communist type setup where everyone contributes according to their abilities and everyone takes out according to their need. But if you speak to former members of the 12 Tribes, they've been worked incredibly hard. And then when they've gone to leave years and years later, they leave with absolutely nothing. No back pay is handed over to them because they're considered to be volunteers. And so I think I know that there are definitely issues with religious freedom, and particularly some of the laws that were being put forward that thankfully didn't get through, but particularly I would say in relation to religious freedom to discriminate against people, including, LGBTQI+ people, all of that kind of thing, absolutely ridiculous. But I really do want to delineate between, religions that are not generally using all of these methods of coercive control and cults, which are much, much more damaging. And you can delineate between the two. So I think the religious freedom argument, it's a bit of a red herring. It should protect people's rights to believe what they want to believe. it shouldn't mean that you can, it's about not discriminating against people for their religion. It's not about being able to discriminate on the basis of your religion, in my opinion.
Yep, well, I share that opinion with you quite strongly, actually. So I agree. And I do think people have the right to believe in whatever it is that they choose to believe. Absolutely. But I do think when institutions or organisations or whatever they would like to call themselves are abusing human rights, I think then we've obviously, it goes without saying, we've got a massive issue, right? I am wanting to talk about your book, Do As I Say, which is fantastic and everyone should get hold of it. So, yes, I have read it. I want to know, how did you jump from being a podcaster, I guess, and doing, I mean, your podcast went off, obviously, but what was the thought process about writing a book? Is that something you'd always wanted to do?
No. No, it had been in the back of my mind. To be honest, I'd actually been pitching a documentary and I was quite keen to do a documentary, which I still hope to be able to do someday, some form of documentary. But honestly, you know, one day I opened up my contact form and there was an email from a major publisher who was asking me whether I'd considered writing a book. And I just thought, well, I guess I'd better consider it. And
it's not every day that happens, by the way.
No, and I feel almost guilty even telling you about it because I know so many authors, like finding a publisher is actually the hardest part of the job. And so I was incredibly fortunate that happened to me. And I'm, you know, I understand the position. And so, but yeah, I worked to put together a book proposal that would actually work for them. And the thing that I wanted to do was, you know, not repackage the podcast into a book, like not just make it a book that was retelling all of these stories. Although, you know, I wouldn't mind doing that in a sense as well, because I think that the book reading audience is quite different from the podcast audience and you can reach more people the more forms of media that you have. But I was really interested in digging into the wider societal issues and the patterns that I was seeing across the groups and all of these other things that I was talking to former members about, and really thinking about what we could be doing better to support them, where the shortcomings are in society, and really getting like all this stuff that was just ticking over in my brain all the time as I was doing the podcast. And so, yeah, I took a year out from the podcast and just focused on writing the book. And it was during the many lockdowns, and you know, most people would think that that's a really great time to write a book, but actually not for me. It was just, I was not doing that well in terms of mental health and I just could not focus. But as soon as I was allowed out and I could kind of book a few weekends away just to focus on the book, that's when I got most of the writing done. And yeah, I'm really proud of it. It's, I never thought that I would be an author, and somehow I am a published author.
You are a published author, and I don't think, you know, it's interesting that you say, oh, I feel guilty telling you the story. You should never feel guilty, because I think the podcast is so phenomenal that your research skills are quite extraordinary. I'm just going to say that. So it's not, anyone who hasn't listened to you, I don't want them thinking, oh, this is just some fluffy, you know, kind of podcast. It isn't. It's, you know, your research skills are brilliant. Your guests are, you know, very, very real, just so people know. And your interviewing style is really lovely, and you're so respectful of them, and it shows all the way through. So for me, I think it was an obvious thing that a publishing house would say, this is something really special, and imagine if we could get it into a book form. Because you're right, not everyone will listen to a podcast, but people will buy books and they will read books. And I think they marry really well together, though, I will say. So when I was reading the book, because I've been, you know, following along the podcast for a long time, they marry. So sometimes when you gave examples in the book of certain cultures, I was like, oh yes, that's right, and you spoke to that person. So they marry really well, but I think it's a much deeper dive in the book, right?
Yeah, it's, I guess the podcast has always been looking at a different cult each episode with, you know, a few different interviews in between that look into some of the wider issues too. But in the book, I just really wanted to dig into what what are we doing here? Why aren't we doing better? And what can be done about it? And so these days I'm really interested in exploring what is effective overseas, and are there any other kind of structures that we can bring back here that might be useful in Australia? And how can we look at this problem without getting stuck in that like religious freedom conversation? Because, so many of these groups, they're not even religious at all. Like the Chung Moo Kwan was a martial arts school. All that guy did was just go to his local martial arts class to try and learn, and, some of them are political, like the Shannon in Canada, who joined FIRE this time, and it was a socialist group, and it was just about helping rebalance society, and ended up being a total cult. Like there's just so many, they come from so many different backgrounds, businesses, like multi-level marketing, a lot of that is very, very culty. So what can we do about these dynamics? How can we stop them? How can we educate people more? And how can we help people who are exiting? Those were the things that those are the things I remain really interested in. But still telling the stories as well, because every day I get people reach out to me who want to share their stories. And maybe they're not ready to talk publicly, but they do share them with me in private. And far out, there are so many of them. And I feel like if we can keep demonstrating how this is happening and how often it's happening and how big this problem really is, surely at some point someone's going to want to do something about it.
Right. And look, I'm a bit staggered. I think through your podcast, through a number of documentaries, through whatever, I'm kind of very blown away by the diversity, I guess, of how many sects and how many cults and how they indoctrinate people into their way of thinking, and how they bring people on board. And, quite often it's, friends of friends of friends or whatever. But, if someone says, my acting career is terrible right now and I don't know what to do, and someone says, well, come and join my community because we can really help you, it makes total sense for you to at least explore it, right? And say, if you're very passionate about something, whether it's in the environment, whether it's about children's rights, whether it's about humanity, whether it's animal liberation, whatever it may be, of course it makes sense that, you gravitate towards things where they're saying, well, we're making a real difference in that space.
Yeah, and all of those examples, I could imagine a cult that pops up from, and there probably is one. We just don't realize that this is the case because, someone who cares about animal rights, that could be a passionate thing that you could hook onto and absolutely get someone invested in your organization around that. So, yeah, I do think understanding the red flags, because obviously there are so many organizations that are not at all problematic and are doing really great things. But the ways that humans interact with each other and the ways we fall into these patterns of kind of power and control, it's the domestic abuse relationship on the one end and the totalitarian governments on the other end. And it's all the same kinds of behaviors across this spectrum of coercive control. And so the more that we can understand these dynamics and see the red flags, I just think there are so many ways that we could value different things in leadership, so that any leader who is coming along and saying that they have all of the answers, that's not someone that we should actually be attracted to at all. That should be a red flag right there. The most effective leadership is a collaborative leadership that takes a lot of different people's opinions on board and has a diversity of viewpoints, because nobody has all the answers, and nor should they.
Yeah, very, very, very true. And we see this a lot, I suppose. You can understand how ideology can lend itself then to becoming something more sinister. And we saw this a lot, obviously. Here in Australia, we see it in Australian politics to a lesser degree, say, than we were watching in horror, I guess, at the American, elections going on and Trump and everything that happened. It was quite bizarre, I think, for a lot of us to think, how did that happen? But then you go, it makes total sense it could happen, because once you get someone to attach themselves to an ideology, it does become very sect-like, doesn't it? Even religion. Even politics.
Even politics, yeah. And as soon as you get to that viewpoint of, like, the ends justify the means, like, whatever it takes, you know, it doesn't matter that Donald Trump said grab them by the pussy or whatever. It doesn't even matter if he has personally done all these things which don't tee up with your evangelical views on life. Like, if the ideology fits, then you're willing to just follow that person no matter what. And that's so dangerous.
Yeah. And that, you know, as we say, and that's very, you know, almost like that's coercive control. It's almost like coercive behaviours, and people fall into it quite. And so when people say, how did you fall into that? How did it happen? And you go, well, how did you follow that particular political leader? I don't really understand that either, right? It's the same thing. You can kind of understand it when you've attached yourself to certain things. So with the book, which is amazing, you know, I'm seeing that you've popped up. You've been on a number of panels, which is fantastic. And I guess the podcast and the book, people see you as a bit of an expert in the field of cults and sects. And what's it been like when you're actually out there? Like I did mention Vivid before, but you've been involved in many. What's it been like being out there on a panel discussion and seeing how many people are actually really invested, like as an audience, really invested in what it is that you're doing?
Oh, I mean, it's wild. Like, it's, I was just speaking with you earlier about how I did a couple of talks at Woodford Folk Festival, and I thought I was just going to be going into like a little side talks panel, because this is a music festival with, you know, thousands and thousands of people there. The talks, I was like, it'll just be in a little tent. There'll be 50 people. And it was absolutely packed. There were so many people there, and they were all there to hear me talk, which is just, you know, I mean, it's really humbling. It's really humbling. And all of their questions were so interesting and really demonstrative of, you know, how wide this problem is. The reason that talk, I'm sure, was that popular was because so many people have had close personal brushes with this issue, whether through a family member or a friend. And I think particularly in some of those more alternative communities, there can be a lot of entry points for cultic type groups, because people are really open. They're really open to new ideas, and it's a wonderful quality to have, but it can make you somewhat vulnerable in some ways. But it's totally humbling. And I've been told I need to just embrace the idea that I am an expert. And like, I really shy away from the word expert, because I just, maybe I'm not that good at being a very charismatic leader. But I think I owe it to the number of people who have spoken to me about their experiences. It's only because I've spoken to all of these people and they've trusted me with their stories that I have come to understand these dynamics. It is absolutely as a result of their generosity and their desire to do something positive with what is a heavily traumatic experience for them. And so I guess I just try to keep that in mind whenever I am in front of some huge crowd of people. That Vivid talk was amazing. That was like, they had to increase the capacity and then it sold out again. And, I'd curated that panel with 3 former cult members, and they were all just so beautifully spoken about their experiences. And it is all credit to them that people were there to hear about those stories.
Yeah, wow, amazing. And one of them, of course, was Claire Ashman, who we talked about, but it was like Laura Sullivan and Laura McConnell-Conti. And, I think you're right. I think that, well, you are very much an expert, even if you're quite humble about it, but you are. And what is an expert? I mean, somebody who has taken the time really to investigate and to understand and to really, oh, there goes a book that just fell down behind me. And you said, I'm not that much of a charismatic leader. I said, so maybe you won't be heading up any cults soon, but you certainly are an expert in the field, which is fantastic. I guess for people listening, and the last things that I want to ask you about is, how do you define, what's the difference between a cult and a sect and maybe just a community group?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yep. Yeah. Well, even, the term sect, I use it in the name of the podcast, Let's Talk About Sects, which is a bit of a fun play, which I sometimes worry leads people to believe it's going to be a bit more humorous than it is, because it's just a deep dive and it's pretty dark stuff. But I think for me, like, a sect is really just a religious offshoot. So I'm definitely talking more about cults, and I make that clear in the intro to every episode. And when I talk about cults, the term cult is very nebulous. It means different things to different people, and it is a contentious term. Like, there are many people in academia who don't want the word cult used about these organizations at all. There are many who advocate using the term new religious movement or high demand group. Now, new religious movement, I would shy away from using that term, because a lot of the groups I look at, they're not religious at all. And I think that there are many new religious movements that are totally not harmful. And I think that there are many that are just trying to pull away from some of the issues with the more mainstream religions, which we've already covered a little bit. And so we shouldn't be tarring those groups with the same brush. High demand group, I can understand, because this is talking about the demands that are expected on people's levels of devotion, their time commitments, probably financial, like their emotional involvement with the organization. So high demand group gets used quite a lot. And so I try to be really careful about defining a cult, and I'm looking at groups that are, they have a very controlling leadership, particularly around the group members' ability to leave and disengage with the ideology. They usually involve some sort of a shunning practice. So if you leave, you may still be able to have contact with your former community, but it will be very limited and it won't be the same. They are usually highly secretive about their inside workings to outsiders. So you'll only really get a sense of like, if you were to go and visit one of these groups, you're never going to get a true impression of what's going on right at the top or on the inside unless you've been involved for quite a period of time. That's often how I get people in as well. Like, from the outside, it's just a very welcoming community, and it takes you a while to kind of get a sense of what's really going on. And then also there's the groups that, and this does exist in some other groups as well, but there's a real us and them mentality. And so anyone outside of the group is just, they're evil, or they're going to hell, or you don't really want to engage with them in any deep level. And so the idea is that they are absolutely right and the rest of the world is wrong, is usually what the ideology, the position is of these organizations. And that what they're doing is using different types of coercive control to keep members in check. And so I have a whole chapter on that in the book where I go into a lot of details. And so there are sort of lots of different examples of how this can manifest in an organization. And so what I say is a couple of these might be present in other community groups, and they could be like slight red flags, but it doesn't mean that that group is a cult. But if you're seeing like many of these aspects in a group that you're involved with, then that is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a cult.
Ah, great. Thank you for that, because I do think people here, and I understand, like, as you say, this academic kind of discussion around what should we use the word, because the word sadly does get bantered around a bit in other ways. Like, I've heard people say, the cult of Gwyneth Paltrow or whatever, right? That's not a cult. I don't know. I don't think it's a cult. But I think when we flippantly use it around, different kinds of idea, people say a lot of people are involved with something and they go, oh, it's a cult. And they use it in more of a jovial, funny kind of way. I think that really, unfortunately, takes away from the trauma, as you say, and the reality of people who are genuinely living and surviving and in those environments, which is not good. I do love, what I love about your podcast as well is that, you talk about cults from all over the world. And I think that that's really important, because I think, and someone said this to me when I mentioned you were coming on to my podcast, and they said, oh, but there really aren't that many, cults in Australia. So, and I'm like, yes, there is. And so I think that's why it's really important, because people, if they're not listening in on these spaces like your podcast or in other people's podcasts, or they're not reading about it, or they're not watching Netflix docos, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, a lot of people would be walking around quite oblivious to the fact that there are all of these sort of cults happening everywhere. Small ones, medium ones, large ones, and enormous corporation type ones.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as I mentioned earlier, like when I started the podcast, I would have been of that mind frame as well. It's like, there's not that many of them. Yes, there are many. There are many in Australia. There are many everywhere. And it sounds like scaremongering or something. It's not, I'm not trying to scaremonger. I'm not saying like we're all about to be snapped up by a cult somewhere, because a lot of them are hugely insular and you're actually never going to come across them. A lot of them don't recruit, like they just rely on members kind of procreating into the group because they're so like insular and isolated. So, you know, yeah, I think that is a huge part of the project, is looking at the groups that are not getting the same kind of sensationalist coverage. Or, you know, I think that a lot of the media coverage has become a lot better recently, and some of these documentaries are absolutely fantastic, but they do still tend to focus on, and of course they do because that's what's going to get the audiences, but they do still focus on the sensational groups and the sensational aspects of those groups. And only when, you know, it's reached some sort of like branding or like, I don't know, sex cult thing or whatever. Yeah. So they're not looking at the groups that are much more insidious and that are really low level, but still causing quite a lot of trauma.
Yeah. And I guess one last point, because I'm really interested in, you know, your ideas on this as well. You know, a lot of cults, if you like, a lot of things don't start out as cults either. So they might start out, am I right, as a genuine, smaller kind of, you know, maybe a bit left of centre or whatever organisation that genuinely wants to help people or wants to build your self-esteem or whatever. And then weirdly they turn into something far more sinister as they become more evolved.
Yeah, I think it mostly depends on the leadership. And so that could be someone who comes into leadership later who kind of turns it into a cult. Or it could be that those particular, you know, manipulative like aspects of like the need for power and control over others, they were there in the first place, but they just didn't really get fed enough to become damaging until the group became bigger and more people started like feeding into the ego. And so it's interesting. Like I always ask former cult members how much they think that their leader really believed in what they were teaching or preaching, and how much do they think was about power and control. And the answer is different every single time. And that's so, so fascinating to me. And so I do think, yes, probably there are groups, like even if you look at Jonestown, right? Jim Jones in the beginning, like he was setting up church groups that were like non-segregated when all of the other groups were rejecting like people of other racial backgrounds. So like there was so much kind of good stuff that it looked like he was trying to achieve. But then if you've got this type of person who believes that, you know, they are the one with all of the answers, as soon as more people start believing in what they're kind of putting out there, and it feeds that ego. And then instead of, when people have criticisms or questions, instead of engaging with them and looking at what they can do to improve, this is the sort of personality who, those are the people who get booted out of the group. You're always surrounding yourself with more and more yes men. I think, you know, the example of what's been happening at Twitter is a really interesting one, where like Elon Musk has come in and just like got rid of anyone who said anything bad. It's like a really current example of watching this exact dynamic happen. And so when you've got someone who then just surrounds themselves with more and more yes men, they're not hearing all the problems. They're dismissing all of the criticisms. And then that's when things can get really damaging.
Yeah, and any sort of platform, as you say, like Twitter's a really great example, but any sort of platform where, you know, there's only going to be one point of view, whatever that may be. And, you know, there are a lot of podcasters, for example, who have millions and millions of followers who only give out one kind of side of the story. And, I mean, it could be any platform, really. It doesn't really matter what it is. But it's quite fascinating, isn't it? And I hadn't thought of Twitter, but you're right. It is that kind of very... You know, I just went, oh, this is really weird, and I left Twitter. But, you know, I guess for a lot of people, they won't leave Twitter.
For the staff who were just like thrown into this situation where all of a sudden they had to deal with, you know, this character who was saying they needed to sleep at the bloody place. Oh, my God.
Yeah, wow, right. Yeah, odd. I know that you're a filmmaker as well. That's your background. I sincerely hope that one day you do get to make a documentary about all of these things. I think you're amazing. I love what you were doing, and I'm so pleased that you continue to put this out in the universe, because I will say enormous gratitude to you, because I can't imagine that it is easy listening to the stories of these brave people who keep coming forward to tell you what's going on, and to tell, to explore what's really going on inside these communities. It must be quite difficult at times for you, Sarah, to hear these stories and to take that on.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. Thanks for all those kind words. That's really, really nice of you. And I get really emotional when I hear some of these stories. Like, some of them are just so incredibly heartbreaking, the things that people have told me. And I think what I try to do is just be so, I guess, aware that how lucky I was to not have been born into one of these organisations, and to never have kind of come across the wrong group at the wrong time and have to deal with what they've had to deal with. And so I try to use that to kind of keep me, I feel like I have the kind of mental health capacity as it stands to be able to listen to these stories and help get them out there. And so I try to be realistic about how many episodes I do every year, which is like a season of 8 every year, and then take some time off, because I have heard a lot of stories about, taking on other people's trauma and how that can really impact you. But I think it's, for me, as someone who has never had to deal with something as full on as what all of these people has, it's kind of like, it's something I can do, and it helps to try and do something.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think what you're doing is incredible, and brave yourself, actually, for putting it out there and for opening yourself up to the stories of other people and sharing those stories with us. I think, as I said before early on, education may be the biggest key to us all understanding and showing a little bit more empathy, compassion, and hopefully some solutions long term. So thank you.
Totally agree. Thank you so much, Sandy.
I'll be putting links in our show notes and across our socials, obviously, where everyone can follow along with you. And let's talk about Sects, and where they can buy your book. And there may be people out there who are listening who are involved in communities or organisations or cults or whatever you want to call it. It's different for everyone, but who may be listening right now who are thinking that they're realizing that perhaps they're not as alone as they thought they were. And so I think that's the power of what you're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandy.
Thanks for listening to the Good Girl Confessional Podcast. The Good Girl Confessional Podcast is brought to you by WB40, Women Beyond 40 magazine, available now at WB40.com. The Good Girl Confessional Podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to quality podcasts. We're also now available on YouTube. We chat with really interesting women about their hard-won wisdom, but it really helps us if you can subscribe, like, and share the podcast. Thanks so much for your support. Bye for now.